Welcome to September, where we have August Dev Call today for you. We are pleased to hear from Jake Miller, littel-wolfur, who runs the Forge, who has been very engaged with building infrastructure at Tlon and with Uqbar, and just being very active in producing tools that are some launched and some upcoming. And today we are happy to talk about Con, which is the new control plane vane for Urbit. So welcome, Jake.
Hey.
All right. Hey. So Con, tell us about where this came from.
Okay, so Con originally started before I was even at Tlon. I believe Joshin was kind of the first person to really think about it and describe a sort of approach to having something like a control plane for hosting. And so that's really where the motivation for Con came around, was we needed a way to inspect things in the runtime within the context of a hosted environment like Kubernetes or whatever Tlon hosting uses. So when I first joined Tlon, that was like sort of the context within which I started working on Con. And so what I did there was I wrote the Hoon side and the Haskell side before the Haskell runtime was sort of deprecated. And I didn't finish the Hoon side. And when Joshin came back, he ended up finishing both the C side and adding some more stuff to the Con vane itself. And so what's interesting about this is that the Con vane was actually really simple to write. It was the runtime part that was harder. And so the vane itself, the Hoon vane, doing that as like a sort of new developer was pretty interesting because I had this very kind of vanes were hard, right? I didn't really want to go and look at them. I was used to just writing Gall apps, and it turns out that vanes are actually pretty easy to write, and they have a lot of the same functionality or patterns as Gall apps, but they just have a lot more power. And that's the thing with Con that we ended up talking about a lot, was like, are we giving people too much power over their Urbits, right? Do we want people to, and maybe that's not the right way to say it, but you don't really want people like scripting,
This is like with Terry Davis Ring Zero.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, I feel like this has been like the overarching question with Con for a while now. And I don't think there's a resolution. I think that it's really going to depend on how the developers use it. And so I think right now, there's not really a lot of people using Con because no one really knows what it's for. It became something different than the control plane idea that we had. And so just to give a little bit more context, when Joshin finished writing Con, it ended up being split into two different things. There's Con, the vane, and there's Conn, C-O-N-N, like from a conning tower. That's the Unix socket implementation. And so now Con really means something different than like a control plane. It's more like a thread runner. So you can actually write threads now or you can run threads by just passing a card to Con instead of doing all of that nonsense with Spider and stuff. So if you look at, say, something like the Discord bot or the 10D, I think 10D bot uses it now.
Yeah, those are the two that are in the wild.
Yeah, so that's what they use Con for. And so like I was talking to Midsum recently, and he was saying how he only knows of Con as the thread runner vane, which I think is good. That's what people should think of Con as now. It is the thing that runs threads.
So do we need to rebrand it then? It's not the control plane.
Yes, it's not the control plane, and it hasn't really ever worked as the control plane because hosting is still using. I think it's still curling to endpoints rather than pinging a Unix socket. And I think that it's hard. You have to write a client, right, for this sort of thing. And so I think having Con as the thread runner vane actually opens up a lot of things that we were really hopeful for when we first started writing Con. But it's become something completely different.
So tell us briefly what Con is now, and then where that came from. Like what was the control plane idea, and how did it coalesce into what Con does now?
So I think this was sort of like it's an evolutionary thing. We worked on the socket stuff pretty separately from the thread runner stuff. And I actually didn't write anything having to do with threads when I wrote the original Con vane. So my work was completely in socket. So I actually don't know a lot about like the thread runner Con vane, right? But I think when we were like trying to define how to actually give this to developers on Urbit, that was my main like advertisement. Was like I was really excited about using it to script things. So not in a hosting environment, but in something like a really generic airlock, right? So you can basically have a bunch of, because the Con vane is just going to communicate in nouns, right? So you're just sending nouns to a socket, and that's it, right? So if you do it like that, then like if you act like an airlock, right, then you just have to construct a set of nouns that are basically going to act as like your sort of API calls, and then you can use whatever client you want, right? As long as that client can connect to the socket, right? And so the best way to think about that and like think about how that would be useful is through threads, because threads, you can basically combine arbitrary logic, written all in Hoon, and write it like a script, right? So threads are really like the bash of Urbit, of Hoon, or of Arv. And so it's really interesting to think about like writing apps that communicate with external things like Emacs, like a Vim, right? Like even something like a text browser. You could have like a text browser just communicate directly with the socket vane rather than hitting the APIs, and then receive back like just HTML. So there's things like that, right? You can do interesting stuff with just having calls to something that runs a thread. So that's how Con became the thread runner, because it was like the most useful thing.
How much latitude do threads have to do system commands? For instance, if I wanted to bar install an app, would I be able to do that using a thread under current architecture?
You can do anything. Anything that you can run in like a generator and an app, you can do in a thread. Like recently, I was playing around with Pete, and I couldn't get it working for like a specific use case, and then I was like, okay, I'm just going to rewrite it all in threads. I don't know why I made that decision, but that's what happened. And then it ended up working perfectly well, right? Like threads can pretty much be apps, can be generators. They're really powerful, but that's also scary because then you don't get the like standardized bespoke interfaces to things. And so if you can imagine people writing their apps as threads only and only running those threads in like Dojo or something, then your app definition kind of gets screwy. But if you run these in apps themselves, right, like in agents, and then are able to just call out easily to threads, then you can package up stuff that is arbitrarily complicated and has some sort of like, a lot of the times threads are used for like IO stuff, but you don't really need to have IO in order to use a thread. Like you can do it for anything.
So in the past, we've had this model where Gall, you go way back, you have like tap and everything, but basically Gall has Spider that is set up to instrument and run threads. And so when you wanted to talk to or initiate a thread before, you had to come via an API into Gall, trigger Spider, Spider would take care of the
Yep.
subscription, run the thread, give you the info back, and you'd run on from there.
Yep.
And in practice, it seems like running con from Gall side isn't terribly different. It's running con from Gall. Anyway, what I'm saying is if I want to run a thread from Gall, it means passing arvo, send k, and then picking the namespace and the other bits.
Yeah.
But it doesn't look that different than running Spider for me as an app developer.
Yes. It doesn't. It's better actually. It looks a lot better. There's less code to write. You don't even have to touch Spider. Like you don't have to import anything from Spider.
Mm-hmm.
You can just pass the card to con, right? And so a lot of Spider's logic is going to be moved into con eventually. The only reason why it's not in there right now is because it needs the Gall rewrite. Essentially, there's a couple of reasons for that, but I don't know. I'll let Joe explain that maybe in the Hangout. But there's a lot of different aspects to like the architecture of Arvo that are really important here, and that this is why a lot of stuff like ends up not being done quickly, even though it seems like it should be obvious, right? Like it's obvious that Spider should live in con if the thread runner vane is con, but the architecture of Gall is complicated, and you can't just like move things out easily. So yeah, that's why Spider's not in con right now, but it pretty much is. Like con itself is going to be the main interface into threads. So you can import Spider still and do all the old ways of running threads, and it will work fine. I'm actually not sure if Spider now like calls out to con. I think it does. Not positive there, but yeah, I think the thing that I am like interested in more is like how to get con actually running from the outside, right? Like not con running to connect to con from con from the outside.
Yep. So to connect to kcon via ccon on the outside.
Yeah.
Should we look at some code?
Interesting. Sure.
Okay. Let me give you.
Okay. Let me see. What should we look at first? We can look at the con vane itself, the con hoon vane. That one.
Which is not very long. This is really one of the shorter veins.
I know, and this is why it was really. This is like, oh man, it really is short. It's longer now. It was shorter before. Before, like there was pretty much just, because there wasn't any Spider stuff. There wasn't any of the read wire, make wire stuff. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe make that text a little bigger if you can.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be hard on YouTube.
Is that good? I'm
not on YouTube, so someone will have to comment if we need to adjust it. We can probably run with it for now.
Okay. So yeah, I think probably the most important part here is to just look at the notes, right? So I think this is the best vein to look at, like when you're first getting started and like are interested in how veins work, because the other veins, like let's take Gall for example.
You don't want to scare him with clay.
Look at all this. No, I don't. But see, like where do you start with this, right? Like if you don't know like the structures of veins, this is going to confuse you even more. Like where even are the notes? I'm pretty sure they're in lull now.
So what I guess then what makes something a vein to Arvo? When Arvo's looking at it, like extrapolating off of, the runtime is looking for an Arvo shaped noun. Arvo is looking for a vane-shaped noun. What makes something a vane-shaped noun here?
So it's now I don't want to say anything wrong here. So anyone YouTube comments just correct me. But I'm pretty sure a vane is defined by these arms here, right? But you can make. Oh, sorry, one second.
Also request
These
for
ones
getting
right
a little bit bigger on the text.
Sorry.
Request for getting it a little bit bigger on the text in the chat too.
Okay.
You should be able to
I
fit
always have-
three words on your screen at a time. Isn't that the presentation dogma?
That's good. I don't know. I wish people would just have better eyes.
Humans.
But yeah, so it's like the veins have to have these arms here, right? So the call arm, the load arm, the take arm might need the scry arm. Yeah, I think it does. That these are to do like the peaks and stuff. But if you think back on like the agent stuff, it's pretty similar, right? Like call is sort of like on poke. But see, this is where you start to see the big differences. Is that you really have access to a lot more in a vane than you do in an agent. So you also have access to the full namespace here, which is the rune type. And an agent doesn't have access. It has access to its own namespace, right? But it doesn't have access to, like a raw access to the namespace. And the take arm is probably the most important here. This is what takes your notes or signs. So you can see here we're looking at Gall. Gall moves, right? The terminology here is I get a little bit like turned around, especially when I have massive COVID brain fog. But
yeah, card means more than one thing inside of Arvo. There's a Gall card and there's an Arvo card, and they're not the same thing, for instance.
Yeah, I think it's like whenever I look at this stuff, I always tend to just like go back to each type and just make sure I'm looking at the correct stuff. But here, yeah, we're pretty much just looking at the sign, right? And so the head tag of the sign, that's going to be the only one we're interested in is the ones coming from Gall, right? And so whenever we receive something from Gall that has like a fact or a poke ack, watch ack, we're going to do something with it, right? And so when you get the fact ones, this is pretty much like you can look back at Spider and see how it did it there. It's pretty much the same, except instead of doing like a bunch of complicated logic with Spider, you just send back another card in con.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's not much here, and that's what's really cool is that this was able to. This made a lot of things in Spider's logic a lot easier to deal with, but it's still using Spider, right? It's still all Spider. But it's a vane, right? So I think that it really like forces you to think about like the different aspects of like user space versus kernel stuff, and like how the things that you write in user space kind of influence like the future development of kernel space. And so here, like, I think that there's this sort of, it's hard to explain, like this dichotomy between scripting and app writing that is not, like, there's not a good story for it on Urbit yet, right? Like you don't really have scripts in Urbit yet.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's either a persistent state,
yeah,
or it's kind of a one-off, like thread-like hit to something, and there's not really anything in between. Generators aren't really quite the same thing.
Right, and it's kind of hard to compose them too, right? Like if you wanted to compose like two scripts In Unix, right, you would just pipe them. Now you can do sort of similar things in Urbit, but it's you don't see a lot of it, right? And I think that like the concept of say something like a call app name and then bar generator, like that stuff is really cool because you basically like construct the input to the poke that you're sending to your app in a generator, and then you can use it in your dojo like as a bespoke sort of command. And I think that we could go further with that in a lot of stuff, maybe with threads too. But like, if you want to actually write scripts and like, maybe have them run on a timer or something, or say like spin up like Urbits that have like specific groups, apps, and stuff like that installed. It's not clear to me how you would do that with what we have right now. But with con, you could con the C. You could basically just construct these nouns here, right? This is the noun that you would send to the Unix socket. This would send a thread, or this would start a thread, and you could do that from outside. And so you can imagine having like an eLisp client right here that just like scripts things by just passing nouns to this socket and doing it all in Lisp. So you could still do like minor stuff, right? Like that you want to, maybe you want to read a file from your Unix home directory or whatever. And you don't want to have to like load that into put and do that whole thing on Urbit, right? It's easier to just like have a script that does these things instead of having to manually copy. And so if you have those things, like if you define only the simple like Unixy manipulations that you have to do in your con like client, and then the rest is just passing nouns to Urbit, then you really have a scripting environment that's nice because you can write everything that's more complicated and more like related to the app that you're building. You can write that in Whom. And that's the biggest problem with like doing anything interesting outside of Urbit, right? But that connects to Urbit, that it's hard to get stuff out of Urbit or put stuff into it. And this would potentially make it easier, but there's the question of like what that means for
circa 2015. That was the selling point, wasn't it?
Yeah, right. Like, yeah, and it was actually we were just talking about this, me and Joe. There was the security drivers. I don't know if you know about these or if you remember them, but you used to be able to write security drivers that would like be basically bespoke API connectors. So there was one for GitHub, for Gmail. You used to be able to like scry into your GitHub PRs, and that was sick, right? Like it was, but then I think the reason why it was scrapped was because Air was rewritten. And okay. I still look at the PR every so often just to remind myself that like a lot of stuff that like we want on Urbit actually has been done before. It needs to be revived.
Well, I mean, Ford used to be able to serve all sorts of things to the clear web that now we're doing in a different way.
Yeah. And what's really cool though is that like everyone like on the kernel dev team knows this, like knows that they scrapped things to do a big rewrite. And there was always the intention to bring this stuff back. It just takes a long time. But it's cool to see like sometimes in our offsites and stuff, like someone will just like go off on like this thing that was worked on like 3 years ago, and then someone else will be like, oh, I wrote up this document that describes exactly how we can get that again, and we just needed to do it the wrong way first. And I think that's the important part about like Urbit development, is that yes, a lot of the times like we do things that seem kind of over the top or not the best implementation, but then the next one is always better, and if it's not better, it describes like why the first one needed to change so that the third one will be better. I don't know, I feel like I've never seen that sort of development out like in the open so clearly before as I have with Urbit stuff.
Well, the standard line on that has been you never rewrite, you just refactor.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the classical software development take on, is that it's always a mistake to rewrite. But I
Yeah.
think that what Urbit has going for it in that regard, and you can see this with the spider con dynamic, for instance, is that it does a lot of thinking about the interplay between protocol / kernel level versus user space level. And so you can try
Yeah.
things out in user space, and if they work well, then you boil them down to the kernel level. And if they don't do exactly what you want, then you leave them in user space and you just keep fiddling with them until you do get it where it is.
Yeah. And so that was exactly the motivation for like doing the dependency work in Citadel, because we don't know how to do this in the kernel yet. There's a couple of ideas that have been bandied about, but no one's really tried too much yet. And so with like the Tlon devs, right? It's easy for them to just be like, oh well, we can just, because we work on the runtime and Arvo all day, like we can just try something here and put it in a separate branch. But like for other devs, right, there's not really a great opportunity for them to sort of attack these sorts of problems once it hits like the vane level, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that there's a great like sort of lever that we can use here, and that's to just get people a little bit more familiar with how vanes work, and that they're not that you can edit them, right? Like you can go into them and put sigpams in them all over the place and debug your ship, and it works fine. And yeah, if you print something too big, you just Control C it and start over. Like it's a great way of just really knowing, what your computer is actually running. But like, there's a lot of things that you might want to test out in user space before putting them in the kernel. One of those things I think is dependencies, right? Like maybe they should live in the kernel, maybe they shouldn't. I don't know, but you might as well try the user space one, the user space side first. And I think with Spider, it's kind of a similar thing, right? Like Spider, it was in user space, and it's just after a while, it seemed like, oh, maybe this is better to live somewhere closer to a vane. It does seem more system level. And then you get something like Con, which is then a very simple vane that simplifies both user space and it doesn't complicate the kernel level. And that's, I think, the biggest thing. It's because you can't just keep adding stuff from user space just because it would be nice to have it in the kernel. It's more like you just don't want it to overcomplicate it.
Shall we take do you have like a Tendybot or something handy that we can look at?
I think
what it looks like in the wild.
Yeah, let me see. I think probably the best one would be the Discord bot.
Okay.
Let's see, I think I have that. Yeah. I was going to show my E-list client here because I had it all set up, but I don't know. I'm scared to demo stuff on these calls, so maybe I'll do it later. Let's see.
Per Murphy's Law, this is the time when it should go wrong if it's going to go wrong.
Exactly.
But one of the things I was thinking about when I was looking at Con was the possibility of getting like an awk-sed style external editor, for doing basically code diffs within. So you can build a REPL or something, and then it's actually the way it's operating is it's just sending diffs back into Clay.
Yeah, I've thought of a lot of stuff like that, and like at the end of the day, though, I always think, shit, like we should just make Dojo like really good. I should just work on making Dojo better, because I feel like anything that I would want to do externally, like I would be better served by having a better Dojo, right? Like if there was a sort of ed style editor in Dojo, which actually I think there's something similar in it. I don't know if that app has been updated for software dist, but someone worked on this a while back. But yeah, it's like if Dojo worked really, really well, we wouldn't really ask for a lot of this stuff. And I think that like if you look in the Dojo code and look at all the like lens in like implementations, right? Like the sort of source sync definitions and all that. You can sort of see that there was a story about getting external things to communicate with Dojo, and Joe was just telling me about like how he had to rewrite, or Lens was kind of like a hack to get the sort of Dojo communication stuff good again after they rewrote. I think it was Dojo or Ford maybe. I don't know, but this is like the endless story with Urbit, is that things keep getting rewritten. There's a hack to like make things work as they did before, and then we sort of lose like why the thing was written in the first place. But yeah, okay. So here's Fo, which is the Discord bot, and
Okay.
yeah. So the timer, where we actually run, sorry, con is, where do we run actually? Here. So you see, this is the new way of running threads, and it's super easy, right? Like you have a thread defined. Well, then you just create a card. So the card itself is basically like this whole thing, but the actual like move or like con call sort of is this here.
Okay.
And so like if this is the input to it, right? Just to the thread. And
So con has a
has
couple of modes. It has the fard, and what's the other one?
Fired.
Fard and fired.
And there's also these a vow and a row. So yeah, I think it's actually pretty well documented. So another good reason to look at con if you're learning about vanes. And
what is a namespace though? Is that a free choice for the user?
Sorry, what do you mean?
What is the namespace simply something you choose when you create the card, kind of like a wire?
Oh, yeah, you mean this part, the post to Discord or add channel part?
No. I mean, you have the wire, but then there's a con has a namespace before the thread name. Is that
you mean,
is that fard and fire? Is that the namespace, or is the namespace something else?
I'm not sure what you mean by namespace here.
If you scroll up in con.hoon, it might be that. The docs in con.hoon call it a namespace.
Oh, I see.
Is that fard arrow? Is that?
Well, the namespace is this here. It's faux. This is confusing because it's like, do we even use namespace anywhere else?
No.
Yeah, that's weird.
I ran into this when I was teaching app school, and I was like, okay.
I mean, I think if you think of like desks as namespaces, then it kind of makes sense. But it's a desk. You're like passing in the desk, and so that's where it'll look for the thread, right? So it'll look for the thread post message in the desk faux. And but yeah, so like let's see if we can find like what spider calls used to look like, because I think they.
Let's see. I know I can probably find one pretty quick too.
Yeah. It's actually kind of, it's like a thread start, right? Yeah. So, let's see here. So the way to communicate with it before was to just directly talk to the spider agent. And so You can still do this. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. But yeah, right here, spider start. Right, so it's a little bit more confusing. It's not that bad.
But you have multiple things you have to do. You have to create it. You have to subscribe to it.
Yep.
And then you're handling all that in on agent.
Mm-hmm.
But with Con, you're handling it in on Arvo.
Yeah. And so there's this. Let's see, what was it? It was. Oh yeah, the PR for Gall threads, for inline threads. I thought I had it up. By Phil. This really shows the power of Con, and it's a little bit scary too. But so yeah, this stuff. So this is pretty crazy. It allows you to like close over like the subject in and out. And so you can define these inline. So see, like, let's see.
Okay, so it's kind of like gate. You can define a gate at the place the gate is used, like in a turn statement. This is doing something similar where you can define a thread right there where you're actually calling.
Yeah, yeah. And there's some issues, I think, with this, with the closing over at that instant of the app state. But it can get confusing, and I don't think most Urbit devs really think about like closures very much in Hoon, because it is most of the time not really an issue, right? Like, you don't have to think about it too much because of the way that Hoon is structured. But this might change that.
Well, MIC-gals don't really get used outside of threads anymore, do they?
Exactly. Yeah. So if it's like, if you start using MIC-gals in Gall apps, you're kind of introducing some scoping issues. Maybe I shouldn't say issues, but just some like things you need to know, right? Like, you need to know how these things close over the subject.
Well, it's sort of like JavaScript promises and await and all that mess makes you have to think very carefully about where you're making calls.
Yeah, it's not that bad, right?
but it's a similar sort of idea where you have to start thinking about how these things mesh with code when you're used to everything happening in compile time at Hoon.
Right.
And this kicks things away from that compile time to some extent.
Kind of, yeah, maybe.
Well, it depends on what you're doing with the MIC-gal.
Yeah, like, it depends on what variables you're closing over, really. See, because like here, right, you get message, right? So you can use the variables here. But like, what about bowl and stuff? I don't know how that would work here. I know I've had some issues with like using like now in threads, right? Like, it's really easy to just forget that each, like the event loop is like, if you send multiple cards, they're going to have the same now. And so you can't, like, this is actually what we ran into with Con, or with Faux, sorry. Because right here, in fetch messages, actually, what we did was, there was, before this loop here, see how we have to sleep? We didn't put that in initially, and it would just like brick your ship. because it would like think that these messages like I don't know, were coming at the same time or something, and was trying to post them to GraphStore with the same timestamp, right? It's like those sorts of things can get very confusing. That's not really like the scoping issue, but threads make things confusing because they require you to really understand the Arvo loop, right, and the event loop of Urbit. But yeah,
Okay.
like I think it's hard to talk about like Con as the thread runner vane when I'm so used to it being that like socket vane, because that's what I've been wanting for so long, and it's kind of like it's there now. The client needs to be built. Like we need like an official client, but like I treat Con as a black box that runs threads now, and so I actually don't really care about how it actually does this. I want to just like make the socket stuff work. But I think that you really need a big client for this, right? Like the client needs to do a lot of work. But like think about it, right? Like if you're dealing with nouns only, how do you write a client that properly sends those nouns and properly
knows what a
those
noun
nouns?
is, knows how to build
Exactly.
a noun. Yep.
So like you get into this like circular state where you're like, oh, okay, well, a client has to do this and this, and then eventually you get to like, oh, this is Urbit. I just should do this all in Urbit. And that's why I think like there's got to be like, this is why I think it's more of an experiment, right? Like this whole thing. That's why the Con vane itself was taken out of the whole socket context and became like the thread runner, because that's in and of itself a good thing. Like it's useful, it made things easier, et cetera, et cetera. And it should be a vane. And yeah, so I think like part of the point of this talk, I think, was to clarify like the differences between like what Con was, what people thought it was going to be, and what it became now, and how we still haven't really like betrayed the original idea here. But that like we realized, well, the hard part about a control plane, right, is the client. You know, the client that connects to it. Right? The protocol for Con is simple. It's just a length encoded buffer with a specific like prefixed byte. It's that that makes Urbit recognize it as a a Con noun, right? So you just send one of those, and then it works, right? There's nothing complicated about that. But like then the client needs to actually be able to orchestrate these things. And so if you want to construct a program that does something externally from Urbit but communicates with it, then you have to really write most of your stuff on Urbit first, like output those nouns, and then you still need a way to connect to Urbit to grab the nouns that you constructed, right? So it's like, what do you do then? Like maybe connect to the HTTP API, grab the nouns that you maybe you have an app, right, that just defines a set of
these, yeah.
Yeah, an app that constructs like an API namespace that you then can grab from your Con client, and then just, honestly, I feel like that could work, because then you could have a really thin Con client, right? That just implements that protocol and sends the nouns, and then in addition to that client, you also have just a little library that grabs the nouns from the API, right? And so you could have a global one, right? Like one where, I don't know, like in a group you have a specific ship that provides API for that group, and then any client could just pull the API definition, which just has all the nouns that you can use to communicate, with what it defines, and then you can just send those, from wherever your client lives.
So there's a question here that I think may be relevant to this. Brian asks, can we talk about the first principles APIs that an Urbit developer will interact with while developing an app?
I wish there was an API for first principles. That would be nice.
Right. I mean, it sort of depends on what you mean by app and what you mean by API when you write that. Most of what's been done is very embedded in the JavaScript browser client.
Yeah, and I don't like
communicating with JSON. But I mean, this is de facto. If someone's writing an app, 99% of the time right now, that's what they're talking about doing.
Yeah, right. And like this makes it kind of hard to answer because there are first principles for JavaScript APIs that are, you know, sort of good. But with Urbit, like, I feel like you have to know the like different pokes that you're sending, right? And that's all your API is, right? It's like the pokes and the peaks. And the closer you can get your like front end API or communicating with Urbit as if you were just poking it from the dojo, the better. And I think that the more disconnected you get from that, the harder it is to maintain that app. And I think if you can make it so even more similar where you can maybe generate some of this code for a front end app, even better. So like one of the things I did was try to get the like vase encoding stuff working for JSON conversions. So if you look at the Citadel repo, it's actually that. There's a library called Etch that allows you to just take any vase. So like all you have to do is, actually I can show it right here. You know what? I don't want to demo this right now.
Too dangerous.
It's too dangerous.
Okay, let's hit a couple more questions and then we can hop over to the meet. The other questions we have are about your setup. So there's a question here about your Emacs dot file.
Yeah, I think this is my last dev call was on this. It's a sad story because I lost like a big chunk of code that I was writing for like having a full landscape on Emacs. So I had like a full buffer where you would just have like the list of all your groups and everything. And so you could send things directly to a chat, like you would evaluate code in the chat, but like have it interact with like your apps and stuff. You can't do that in chat about right now. But yeah, so for actual development though, I mean, I really don't want to show you my dot files. They're a giant mess. But like, there's a couple of things. One is I have a key binding for just searching the Git repo. So you see, like I am in. Let's see. I'm not in the Git repo right now, right? I'm in my desk, and so this is. I do a lot of my development in like desks on my ships instead of like doing them in Git repos. Which is terrible, and it's how you lose a lot of code. But it's also fun because like you find out a lot about what Urbit needs for actual development to happen here. But so I do this in my moons, but then whenever I'm in a Hoon file, I have a specific set of like key bindings that I've defined. So I can build the file. These are in the Hoon mode Emacs package. I also have some of these ones. And so one of the things that always bothered me about the Hoon mode is that I couldn't jump to definitions. I still can't really, because it's a hard problem. We need the docs work to doc chord stuff to get done, because then we'll be able to like know the source of every type. But yeah, whenever I'm in a Hoon file, I have like these. I can jump to resource, right? So this actually just searches the Hoon, the Urbit repo or the Urbit docs repo for everything that mentions resource. Then I can grep like the source with CLL. That greps that my actual Git repo for these things. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Like it's not that much. You don't really need a lot of development, you know, utilities in Hoon, right? You can pretty much just write it. How even syntax highlighting. A lot of the times I barely have syntax highlighting because I'm on my Emac or my e-ink, so I can't see colors anyway.
So here's a question, possibly jocose, but what would this even mean? I'm imagining bootleg veins, loosen the ecosystem. The problem is a lot of this stuff touches the runtime.
You can do this though, like
yeah, but you could write your own Urbit.
Just write your own vane and like distribute it. Like, I mean, it's not like, yeah, you can't distribute it like software distribution. You can distribute it in a base desk. You could have a star that everyone underneath gets OTAs from, and just have your vane there, or just, you know, set your OTAs to a moon that has custom vanes. Like, I really think that like people are forgetting how easy it is to do stuff like that, and it's actually like you could have a lot of really interesting stuff, right? Like, don't like Con, right? Prefer the normal way of running Spider, then, you know, ship an OTA that doesn't have Con. Just won't get updates.
Right. I mean, there's kind of an interesting question of what would happen if people actually started rolling their own conflicting vanes with you know, different the same letters, occupied, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would be curious about like what happens when, yeah, like, but what happens when like you change a vane and it subtly like changes this, you know, the state of, you know, something important, and then you go back to the original vane and somehow something like things still work, but, you know, you've messed up this part of it. I don't know. I don't like there's a lot of interesting questions that haven't been answered because no one's tried doing this yet. I don't think there's a real reason yet either, right? Like, everything that you can do in a vane that you would want to do custom, you can pretty much do in an app right now. It's when things get like performance related stuff. That's why the Uqbar stuff is so interesting, because they're like working on things where performance really matters in specific cases. And so you also need like there was this idea to like make like an Uqbar vane, and there's this the conceptually it doesn't really make a lot of like vanes as the like interface into Urbit's kernel. That's kind of what we think of vanes as, and so that as a metaphor, I think works well in some cases, and then also can be misleading in others, because like you don't want a custom vane for like app specific stuff, maybe for like big compute specific stuff, but for just communication patterns, like you don't need a separate vane. You know, just define your Gall app correctly.
All right. Let's see. Is there anything else we should know about Con use cases, et cetera, before we roll over to the group chat?
Yes, I think that Con as a thread runner definitely needs some use, right? Like, people need to use it more to kind of iron out the bugs. I'm a bit worried about it because I ran into a bunch when Midsum and I were doing the faux stuff. Bugs that, like, because with normal Spider, right, if your thread didn't work or if it did something crazy, like, it wouldn't kill everything, you know? Like, you'd still be able to use your ship. I actually had to edit the Gall source to fix an issue that arose when like we were running threads from faux and then like quitting those threads and then restarting the app, right? So like the threads would keep Con would keep asking Gall to like run threads or something, and because it's a vane, right, it's on a different life cycle than apps, and so it got into this state where I had to literally clear the blocked queue of Gall. So that's something to really keep in mind, because that's one of the benefits of keeping things in user space, that you don't run into situations like this. And it's probably why Urbit has been so stable in terms of like you being able to, you know, edit Gall or edit Gall apps and do whatever you want, and those apps breaking, but not actually bricking your ship. So yeah, I think that's it. Oh, and also there will be a client soon. I'm almost done with the eList one. So that'll be cool.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Jake. We will,
Right.
I've dropped the Q&A link in the comments as well, which should be fine because I think it'll burn once we're done with it. And see you all over there. Also join us next week for communal computing, and we'll talk about Internet of Things.
That one should be good because it'll be related to this.
Yeah, right. This Con is the way that you would effect that kind of interactivity.
Yep.
So, all right. See you all over there.